Tom Zutat here. I'm excited for episode number 20. We're going to talk about Jonathan Davis and Korn. Man, I got to thank all of you that obviously watched my Children of the Korn short more than once. And hey, a little known fact, Jonathan Davis was a big fan of Children of the Korn, and that's why he named his band Korn. If you're here, you know what that means? That means that you're already in. So you don't have to say, can you get me in, right? You're here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Jonathan Davis. And I actually met him in Prague, and it turned into something really like a historical discussion, which brings up a lot of even, deeper things to think about. And, music today seems pretty like a lot of it. I'm not saying all of it, but a lot of it seems pretty throwaway. In the 70s, it was like Four Dead in Ohio. Bob Dylan was, talking about the nature of culture and society. The Recording Academy was called the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. Now it's just the Grammys, and it's like a network show where they give people awards. And a lot of folks today, they're writing songs about, I got to get some money, I want some money, let's make a lot of money. And, people are like crazy focused on that. And, in the 70s and even in the 60s, hey, 70% of music was songs about love and the trials and tribulations of love. But now we got a lot of music that's focused on or made for making money. And a lot of people are not learning how to play instruments anymore, like the school bands and orchestras are disappearing. Kids are not getting instruments. And there's a reason I'm saying this. And Jonathan Davis is like a really deep dude. Like, he's super smart. Heck, he grew up, his dad played music with Frank Zappa. He was a keyboardist with Zappa, and he was a keyboardist with Buck Owens. So, talk about the genre bending that people like today, right? It's very popular to like a bunch of different genres. And, here his dad is playing with Buck Owens. He was born and grew up in Bakersfield. Bakersfield is like a big country town. It is like the country music capital of California. So imagine you grow up there and you're a goth kid with the black fingernails and the dark makeup, and kids are bullying you and making fun of you in high school. You're probably weird and quirky, right? If your dad went from Buck Owens to Frank Zappa, you'd probably be a weird kid too. And he grew up in that environment. His parents got divorced. His mom married somebody he didn't get along with, so he went to live with his dad, and then he started having all these crazy ideas about his stepmom. And, there's, of course, you could dig deeper into this history, but my main thing I'm trying to point out is that Jonathan Davis is one smart dude. He's cultured in a lot of different areas. He has a passion for music, and I would give him some of the credit, for creating nu metal. Now, nu metal is part rap, part hip hop, part funk, part soul, and part heavy metal. And that's why they call it nu metal. And, songs like Got the Life, Falling Away From Me, Freak on a Leash, like, those three songs like really opened up my mind to this whole different kind of hard rock music. And I remember those songs way more than I remember like a Stain song or a Limp Bizkit song. And interestingly enough, All in the Family was a song that Korn did and Jonathan Davis did with Fred Durst from Limp Bizkit. And, Fred was very supportive of Korn when they first came out. Jonathan Davis also was a very, heavy drug user, all kinds of different drugs. He probably tried them all. And when the Family Values tour came up, he just kind of like said, that's it. I'm not going to do drugs anymore. I got to stop. I got to do it for my kids. he married his high school sweetheart too, which is interesting. And he had a son named Nathan. And then that didn't last too long. And it's really hard for rock musicians that are touring to keep family life and a marriage together. He later met a Ford modeling agency model that also had some parts in some movies and stuff like that. And her name was Devin. And they had a couple of kids. And, one was named Pirate. Can you imagine growing up and your name is Pirate? How about that? And his other kid was named Zeppelin. So, Jonathan Davis was heavy into music, right? So he's got Pirate, he's got Zeppelin, and he's got Nathan from his first marriage. And, the crazy thing is that Devin went heavy into drug use. And, she was just not there for the kids. She got, it's alleged that, and I'll say alleged because I wasn't there, but it's alleged that she got violent both with Jonathan Davis and was not right with the kids in some angry kind of way. So they end up getting divorced, and Jonathan ends up being a single parent. And, his kids weren't with him when I met him in Prague. So, but we talked a lot about his kids. He was obsessed as much with his kids as he was the music and making sure that they're taken care of and everything's okay with them. I kind of wished that he'd brought him with him so I could have met him, because he was telling me all about him. And I found it really interesting, and I mean, here's this guy who wrote these 3 great songs that really exploded that whole nu metal sound. I mean, Godsmack were in there, and Jonathan Davis has a voice that can go from angry to like a high-pitched scream, and it's amazing that he has that kind of range, right? But by musical definition he's considered a tenor, but he exposed this new kind of music to us. Those 3 songs were a pivotal part of that period of my life in those years. And it was kind of fun to meet him in Prague. And, I knew that there was probably a reason. And, you always hear from people, go to Prague, right? Go to Prague. Prague's an amazing city. It's inexpensive. And, Prague is a very cultured city. It's a deep thinking city with deep thinking people that are cultured. Talk about popular culture. They love music, they love art, they love poetry. Their first Democratic president, Václav Havel, was a dissident artist, poet, and playwright. And I vaguely remember in 1989, I was out on tour with GNR and working with some other bands and Tesla and I mean Motley Crue, you name it. But I remember this story about there being like people power on the streets of Prague, and hearing how the communist government was kicked out, but I never really understood the full story. So Jonathan Davis and I were talking about the Plastic People of the Universe, and I'm like, I never heard of them. And he goes, they're like the most famous band in all of what's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about their history. And so he starts telling me how, the band formed like in the 70s, and they were banned by the communist government. So literally, in order to make a recording under communist rule, you had to get a music license. And so the communist government refused to give this band a music license. So they had to play like secret gigs and rehearse in, underground basements and warehouses. And people would literally record their music, and then they would make copies of it on tape and pass it around. And, they became the biggest band in Czechoslovakia without ever having put a record out. And because of this communist band, they literally had to go to France and record a record. A French label put it out, and then the French record label snuck copies back into Czechoslovakia, because people had turntables and there were licensed, records available for people to listen to. But the band were not political, right? They were not dissidents. They were not protesting. They were influenced by, get this, and this is probably why Jonathan went down the rabbit hole about it, is because they were influenced by Frank Zappa and the Velvet Underground. Of course, how could Jonathan not have a curiosity about Frank Zappa since his dad played for Zappa? So that's probably part of what drove him to really research and find out this whole history and share it with me. And so later, in 1989, there was the Velvet Revolution, and what spun or created the environment for the Velvet Revolution is the Plastic People of the Universe set up some secret gigs, and they set them up in the Bohemian part of the Czech Republic, south of Prague. And so the Communist Party had the police basically line all the roads that led to this little town in the southern Czech Republic, and they arrested everybody on their way to the concert. So people didn't make it to the concert. And a couple of years later, the band again tried to play a concert, but this time in Prague. It was a festival. And the band were arrested and put in jail and charged with crimes like, bogus charges like, revolutionary discussions and, creating dissidents and hate against the Communist Party. And so there were all these charges, and Václav Havel, he wrote a play because he was also a playwright, like I mentioned earlier. So he wrote a play called Chapter 77, and it ended up becoming one of the most popular plays in Czechoslovakia. And people would go to this play, and it was all about the trial of this band, and this band being persecuted by the communist government, not being allowed to play concerts, not being allowed to record and have a music license to make recordings. And it seems like the more the communist government tried to stop this band and their music, the more people became empathetic towards the band. And so now with Václav Havel putting together this play, the Chapter 77, it really created this groundswelling of people that were outraged that these musicians that were inspired by Zappa and Velvet Underground were being put in prison for 2 years for no reason. Like, it was just a tyranny, against the people. So there was like a Czech Republic Day, and people protested at the colleges, and it was like a normal protest every year, and it was somewhat tolerated. But this year, 100,000 people came, and it started on November 17th, and by November 28th, there were 500,000 people participating in the Velvet Revolution. 500,000 people. Can you imagine what would happen if 500,000 people showed up in an American city to protest something? So by November 28th, the communist regime resigned, and they made this poet and playwright who was the leader of this dissident movement and who wrote the play about the Plastic People of the Universe's saga, of being creatively restricted for more than 20 years. They literally showed up and they took down the communist regime without a single bullet being fired. And I'll never forget, I wish I could tell the story half as good as Jonathan Davis, because it was riveting. My mind was blown. It was absolutely freaking amazing. And, it made me think a lot about like, look at our country. Yeah, we had Vietnam War protests, and we have protests. We have protests going on now. But, back in the 70s, in the 60s, you had Dylan, and a lot of musicians were writing songs that showed empathy towards the people and, tried to sort of take out the, bad practices and fighting wars that made no sense, and, music had like an effect on the human psyche and human nature and the power of the people and trying to do the right thing against corruption. And now, a lot of our music is, not really about any of that. It's just about making money. It's not even love songs really anymore, or songs about the trials and tribulation of human nature and the human saga or the human plight. So that's why I found this story so inspirational. And, here we are with, communist China and communist Russia. They're out there trying to spread this kind of tyranny again. And it's interesting to me that we're living in a climate where things seem to be based on a lot of greed, and they seem to be, the spread of communists. It seems to be like trying to expand. But again, this is not really about politics, but, Jonathan Davis, this is to illustrate how insightful Jonathan Davis was about how people power, the revolution, the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel, and the plastic people of the universe took communists out of Czechoslovakia, and now we have the Czech Republic and Slovakia, two democratic countries. But let's go a little deeper into Jonathan Davis, right? Because these are just interesting things. I mean, he is a fascinating dude. I mean, do you know his first job was he was an embalmer at funeral homes. And, he became like really, really upset because as he was embalming in funeral homes, there were more and more dead babies and young kids coming in that had found their parents' stash and had overdosed. And, he said in interviews how much this had an effect on him. And, there was a period of time in his life where he was collecting like memorabilia from serial killers. Like, he had Ted Bundy's Volkswagen, right? He had 2 of John Wayne Gacy's clown suits, right? He had some of the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez's original drawings. And so he was collecting this memorabilia, and he was thinking about opening up a museum. And then, he went through all these drug problems himself. He, the fame and the success, it messes with you, and the money. And, he ends up with all this stuff. And now he's got Nathan from his first marriage. He's got Pirate and Zeppelin from his second marriage. His second marriage ends up in a divorce, and Devin, his wife, goes off the deep end on drugs, and she ultimately overdoses, leaving Jonathan as a single parent. And he decides to get rid of all of this memorabilia. He really gets rid of it because he's like, how can I have this stuff around my kids, right? It makes sense. And, again, he gave up drugs himself, because he wanted to be there for his kids. And a lot of our discussion, when he wasn't educating me on the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, he was talking to me about his kids and what he does with his kids. And, he's a really like a strong family man. And in 2021, COVID got him, and it really affected him a lot. And, he had to bring out a chair and do some of his performances from a chair. He's on the mend now. But, and he has some really great solo records too. But, when we finish here, you should play, Got the Life, Falling Away From Me, and Freak on a Leash, because I think that those are 3 songs that changed music, like that next twist and turn after Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and that whole new metal incorporated some of the grunge in it as well. So go listen to those songs, check out Jonathan Davis's solo stuff, and realize how interesting he was. Like, he was on tour. I'm going to tell you one last little tidbit. He was out on tour, and he went to the H.R. Geiger Museum. Now, H.R. Geiger is famous for creating a lot of props and stuff in Hollywood, but H.R. Geiger created the alien, the alien stuff, and that image of the alien. What would it be without H.R. Geiger's artwork that made that thing look so scary? So H.R. Geiger created 5 mic stands for Jonathan Davis. So when you see Korn perform, he'll be using one of those 3 mic stands that he kept. H.R. Geiger kept 2 of them, and there's rumor that one of them might have gone up for sale or been sold to a private collector, and the 5th one is in the H.R. Geiger Museum in Switzerland. So let's go, hey for Korn, hey for the people power of Czechoslovakia taking out communism without a single bullet being fired. And that is how powerful rock music can be.